There is a kind of boy who solves the problem in 40 seconds and then disappears for the rest of his life. You probably knew one. You might have been one. He's the kid who finished the test first and got nothing for it. The one teachers called brilliant and bosses called difficult. The man who, at 30, 35, 40, looks at his life and cannot understand why someone with half his talent built twice the result. Here's what nobody told him. Here's what nobody told you. The ancient texts are very clear on this, and there's a verse in Proverbs that explains, with surgical precision, exactly why the most gifted minds break themselves. Solomon wrote it 3,000 years ago. He was watching it happen then. He'd watch it happen now. A man who lacks self-control is like a city whose walls are broken through. Read it again. Not weak, not lazy, not stupid. Talented enough to be a city. Undefended enough to be ruined. If you've ever wondered why your structures never stick, why you can see the answer and still not hold it, this is the moment it changes. This is the story of a coach named Ruben and a 16-year-old boy named Felix, and the thing Ruben did that no coach had ever done for him. What Ruben did was not a new system. It was not a better schedule. It was a single decision that cost him everything comfortable, and it is the only thing in this story that actually worked. Ruben was 38. A competitive archery coach at a community sports center on the east side of a city he'd lived in his whole life. 8 years coaching kids. For years before that on the national qualifying circuit himself, where he had been, and this was said plainly, by people who knew the most naturally gifted shooter of his generation. He had believed it. That was the problem. He never made it. The closest he came was the regional qualifier in 2009, a cold gymnasium in November, the kind of light that makes everything look like a photograph taken too late. He drew the bow in the final round. He held for 2 seconds. He released before he was ready, the way he always released before he was ready, and the arrow hit outside the ring by the width of a finger. He drove home alone. He did not enter another competition. He told himself he would come back to it. He did not come back to it. We'll come back to why. A pastor from a small church 2 blocks from the center asked Ruben if he'd run a study hall on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. 6 boys, ages 14 to 17, all of them 1 bad semester from dropping out. The pastor said it like this: they have minds. We just can't find them. Ruben said yes before he thought about it. The first session was 11 minutes long before it stopped being a session. Felix walked in second. Tall, quiet, sneakers covered in ballpoint pen drawings. Ruben put a problem on the whiteboard, an algebra question one of the boys had failed 3 times. Felix looked at it for maybe 7 seconds. Got up. Solved it. Sat back down. 40 seconds. Total. Then he spent the next 22 minutes drawing on his sneaker. By minute 11 the other boys were on their phones. 1 was asleep. 2 were arguing about a video Ruben couldn't see. Felix was still drawing. Tongue between his teeth. Completely absorbed in a shoe. Ruben stood at the whiteboard with the marker in his hand, and a recognition crawled up his spine that he had not expected and did not want. He had been Felix. He had been Felix at 16, and at 22, and at 26, and at 31. He had been Felix the night before the biggest competition of his life, full of talent, empty of hold. And nobody, not one coach, not one mentor, not one pastor, had ever told him the real problem. They told him he had potential. They told him to focus. They told him to work harder. None of them named the actual disease. He looked at Felix drawing on a shoe and he thought, if I do this wrong, I'm going to coach a copy of myself into the same wall I hit. There's a teaching in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Chapter 9. He compares the discipline life to an athlete, and then he says something that doesn't make sense until it does. I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others I myself should be disqualified. Most people read that and think it's about restraint, about saying no to things, about willpower as a kind of armor. That's not what it is. Paul is describing an archer. The Greek word he uses, hupiazo, literally means to bring under, to hold in tension. It is the word for a body that has learned to be the instrument, not the obstacle. Here's what nobody tells you about the gifted mind. The reason your brilliance has not produced what it should is not because you have too much fire. It's because you have no string. Talent without tension dissipates. Tension is not the enemy, it is the instrument. The bow does not resent being drawn. The arrow does not fly despite the pull. The arrow flies because of the pull. Solomon understood this. Paul understood this. Every culture that ever produced a craftsman, a scholar, a warrior, a saint understood this. The modern world has forgotten it. We teach our gifted boys to chase comfort and call it freedom. Then we wonder why they end up at 30 with 12 unfinished projects and a quiet, gnawing shame. Reuben knew the verse. He did not yet know how to live it. And the difference between knowing a principle and being qualified to teach it, that difference was about to cost him the one boy he most needed to reach. So he did what any decent coach would do. He built structure, printed schedules, color-coded by subject. A clear plastic box at the door for phones, drop yours in when you walk in, pick it up when you leave. 40-minute work blocks with a 5-minute break. A whiteboard at the front with the night's goals. He laminated things. He bought a timer. It looked, on paper, like a system that would work. It looked like a bow. It had no string. 3 sessions in, the boys had stopped fighting it. The phones went in the box. The schedules sat in front of them. The timer ran. They sat at the tables for 40 minutes and looked like boys studying. Reuben watched them and felt something cold settle in his chest. They were compliant. They were not changed. The walls were up. The city inside was empty. You could see it in their eyes, that particular flatness boys get when they've decided to wait out an adult. Underneath the order, the boys still believed their minds belonged to no one, not to themselves, not to anyone above them, not to anything worth the cost of attention. Felix did the work. Felix did exactly the work. Not one problem more. Not 1 minute of curiosity. He'd finish his assignment and then sit, perfectly still, staring at the wall until the timer ran out. What Reuben did next would cost him the one boy he most needed to reach. Then Felix stopped coming. 1 session. Then 2. By the 3rd Thursday, his chair sat empty with the laminated schedule still on it, untouched, the corners curled slightly from the heat of the lights. Reuben sat in his car after that session for a long time. Once, walking back from the center, he saw Felix across the street, hood up, hands in his pockets, moving fast. Reuben opened his mouth, closed it, let him go. He had built a structure that good boys could comply with and gifted boys could escape from. He had not asked the deeper question, and he was beginning to suspect the answer was something he could not give the boys because he had never given it to himself. What does a mind need before structure can hold it? I'll tell you. But first, the reason your structure isn't working is not that your structure is wrong. Forget the schedules for a moment. Here is what almost no one understands about discipline. The reason your structure isn't working is not that your structure is wrong. It's that you have not yet decided who the structure is for. Because what Reuben did next failed worse than anything he'd tried. And what came out of that failure is the only thing in this whole story that actually works. He had tried to fix behavior with schedules. Now he would test whether tension itself could teach. The next Tuesday, Reuben canceled the study hall. He drove the boys, the 5 who showed up, to the archery range at the back of the sports center. Empty room. Concrete floor. Rubber mats. Targets at 15 meters. He'd taught hundreds of teenagers to shoot in that room. He put a bow in Felix's hands when Felix arrived, 20 minutes late, looking bored. Felix had never held one. He drew it in one motion, clean, intuitive, the way a body knows things it was never taught. Reuben had seen maybe 4 boys in his career draw a bow that naturally on the first try. And then Felix released. Before he had aimed, the arrow hit the wall 6 feet to the left of the target and bounced. Felix laughed. Drew again. Released the second he hit anchor point. Hit the wall on the right. Reuben said, quietly, hold it. Felix drew again. Held for half a second. Released. Hold it longer. Quarter of a second. Felix. Hold the tension. And then Reuben spoke Paul's words out loud in the empty range, slowly, the way you'd read something to a child who didn't yet know what the words were going to do to him. I discipline my body and keep it under control. Felix lowered the bow. He looked at Reuben for a long moment. 16 years old. Sharp as a knife. Tired in a way 16-year-olds shouldn't be tired. He said, I don't see the point. He set the bow down on the rubber mat. One end of it kept vibrating. He walked out of the range. The other boys followed within minutes. Nobody said anything. The last boy out left the door open. Reuben didn't move to close it. The room that had echoed with teenage laughter, the timer beeps, the low arguing, the scrape of chairs, was suddenly louder in its emptiness. Had he just proved Felix right about discipline? Reuben stood alone in the empty range at dusk. The fluorescent lights hummed. The bow was still on the mat. He walked over and picked it up. He drew it. Anchor point. Breath. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He released into the target. The arrow hit. Not the center. Inside the ring. And he realized, standing there in an empty room at 38 years old, that his hands were shaking. Not from the weight of the bow. He'd drawn that bow 10,000 times. His hands were shaking because the act of holding tension for 8 seconds had become unfamiliar to him. He had been coaching a discipline he stopped practicing the day he walked away from competition. The reason Ruben never made it to nationals was not what he had told himself for 15 years. He was finding it out now, alone in an empty archery range, with shaking hands. He sat down on the rubber mat with the bow across his knees. The grip tape was worn through in 2 places, the exact places his hands had always landed. He had not noticed that before. And the thought arrived calm, almost gentle, the way the worst thoughts arrive. I am the wrong man for this. He had spent his 20s not finishing things. He had spent his 30s coaching other people to finish them. He had built a quiet, respectable life on a foundation he had never personally tested. What right did he have to call Felix to attention he himself had stopped holding? He could have quit that night. It would have been clean. He could have told the pastor he wasn't the right fit. The boys would have moved on. Nobody would have blamed him. He sat on the mat for almost an hour. And the only thing that kept him from quitting was this: if he walked away from the range that night, he would prove the exact thing he was trying to disprove. That the gifted are exempt from the daily cost. That talent has a back door. That Felix, in 20 years, would be him. The only way to stay honest before God was to stay. He didn't decide to become a different man. He decided to come back at 6 a.m. Structure doesn't create a self. It reveals the self you've already decided to be. He had not yet decided. Tomorrow morning, he would. He didn't tell anyone. He arrived at the community center at 6 the next morning. The cleaning staff was just finishing. The coffee maker in the break room was still running. He could hear it from the hall. He sat at the same table where the study hall met, turned his phone face down, and opened his worn leather Bible to Proverbs 25, verse 28, and he read it aloud to an empty room. Then he sat in silence for 30 minutes. He did the same thing the next morning. And the next. He almost stayed home on the 4th morning. He sat in the car in the dark parking lot for 6 minutes, engine running, hands on the wheel. Then he turned the engine off. Not because he felt ready. Because this was who he was deciding to be, whether anyone ever knew it or not. He kept coming. He did not announce a new program. He did not change the structure of the study hall. He did not call Felix. He did not write a sermon in his head about what he would say to the boys when they came back. He just came at 6 a.m. By the end of the first week, Ruben had already decided this table was where he belonged whether anyone came or not. Then Marcus, the youngest, 14, showed up at 6:40 and sat down without saying anything. Ruben didn't acknowledge him. Marcus opened a notebook and started reading a textbook he'd been failing. By the end of the second week, 3 of the boys were there before 7. The Tuesday of the third week, Felix walked in at 6:55. He didn't say where he'd been. He took his old seat. He opened his notebook. The laminated schedule was gone from his chair. Ruben had thrown it out the morning after the archery range. Ruben did not say welcome back. He did not say anything. He nodded once. He kept reading. The boys arriving was consequence. It was not proof. The sessions changed. Not in structure. In texture. Slower. More deliberate. When Ruben taught now, he taught from a place of this is what I am also practicing, not this is what you should do. He gave the boys 4 rules, not as rules, but 1 per morning, delivered directly, without ceremony, as the thing he was staking his own 6 a.m. on. The first morning he said, your mind is not yours. It was given. You will return it. A week later, the tension you avoid is the instrument. The week after, same time, same place. Every day. That is the altar. And then, on the morning Felix had been coming for 2 weeks without missing a day, Ruben said the last one, discipline is not the cage of the gift. It is the bow. Felix wrote it down. He didn't look up. He just wrote it down. 8 weeks after the first session, Ruben took the boys back to the range. Felix picked up the bow. He drew it. Anchor point. Breath. He held it. 1 full breath. In. Out. The bow trembled slightly. Felix's eyes were closed. Reuben watched the muscles in his shoulder lock and release, and then settle. Felix opened his eyes. Released. The arrow hit. Not the center. Inside the ring. Reuben didn't say good shot. He didn't say I knew you could do it. He walked over and said, quietly, what did you feel? In the moment you decided to hold? Felix lowered the bow. He thought about it for a long time. He said, like I was deciding something. He was. Reuben stood in that range and remembered the cold gymnasium in 2009. The arrow released too early. The width of a finger. The drive home alone. He had been Felix then, full of gift, empty of hold. What Felix had just done in one breath was what Reuben had spent 15 years failing to do. The boy who solved the problem in 40 seconds doesn't need more problems. He needs somewhere to hold the tension. Reuben nodded once. He did not explain. He did not turn it into a lesson. He understood, standing in that range, that what had just happened was not a skill. It was a self. Felix had chosen, for one breath, to be the kind of person who holds tension. He had become someone who could decide. That is everything. Reuben walked back to the line and picked up his own bow. The chaos hadn't taught him this. The schedules hadn't taught him this. The verse hadn't taught him this, not until he started reading it aloud in an empty room at 6 a.m. for 21 mornings before anyone else arrived. The mind submits to what it sees submitted. In your living room at 6 a.m., tension is not the enemy. It is the instrument. It was always the instrument. That is what deciding looks like. One breath. One choice. One held tension. You know this story. This is not Reuben's story. This is not Felix's story. This is the story of every person watching this who knows, has known for years, that the gap between who you are and who you could be is not a gap of talent. It never was. You have been Felix. Drawing the bow without holding it. Solving the problem and disappearing. Brilliant for 40 seconds at a time. Wondering, quietly, why your life has not added up to what was always inside you. You do not have to stay Felix. Here is your challenge. Not tomorrow. Not when you feel ready. Tonight. Pick one place. One time. One text. Tomorrow morning, before the boys arrive in your life, before the calls and the screens and the noise, sit at that place, at that time, with that text. 30 minutes. No phone. Do it tomorrow. Do it the next day. Do it for 21 days. You will not feel changed. You will feel ridiculous. You will feel like nothing is happening. That is what something happening feels like, before you can see it. My name is Elias. In 2019, I had a resignation letter typed, the cursor on send, and I still could not explain to my wife why I was about to walk away from everything we had built. I could solve problems in minutes and still not stay in the room for the years they required. I know what it is to be brilliant for 40 seconds and absent for years. What I found in the ancient texts that year is on this channel. If you decided today that you are done being brilliant for 40 seconds and lost for 40 years, if you are ready to start drawing the bow and holding it, type 3 words in the comments. Not as a comment, as a covenant with yourself. I will hold. That is not a phrase. That is a decision. And the people who type it tonight will read it back to themselves in 6 months and know exactly when their life started over. Share this with one person whose mind you have watched go to waste. Not because I asked. Because you know who they are. Subscribe because there is more of this. There are more verses. There are more stories. And the work of stewarding a mind is long, and you should not do it alone. Father, we come to you tonight with minds you gave us and we have not stewarded. We have been brilliant for 40 seconds and absent for years. We have called our drift freedom and our distraction rest. We confess that we have drawn the bow many times and refused to hold the tension. Teach us to hold. Teach us to come to the same place at the same time, not because we feel like it, but because you are worth the discipline of our attention. We do not ask to become impressive. We ask to become faithful. In the name of Jesus. Amen. The arrow does not fly despite the pull. The arrow flies because of it. Hold.